began to happen. Well, David Koresh says that having the ATF come in would be like the little brother coming in and beating up on you. And then the big brother comes in and beats up on you even more. So the FBI takes over from the ATF. And now we go into the long 51-day standoff. The FBI did a lot of things during that time. They had daily press conferences. They had negotiations going on with Branch Davidians, many hours every day. And I thought we could spend some time just discussing that, things they did right, things they did wrong. Let me get some feedback on that.
There was more than one FBI team there. You had the hostage rescue team. They're the tactical operators, their SWAT team. You had a team of negotiators, or you had FBI negotiation coordinators. Some of their negotiators were FBI agents. Some were police officers from Austin. And one FBI agent from Austin was Byron Sage. And then the special agent in charge, Jeffrey Jamar, he had a bureaucratic role above being a special agent in charge of an office. And so he was brought in to be the on-site commander. And an important thing is that everything they did on the ground in Waco, they were reporting to a command center in the Hoover Building in Washington, D.C. It's called the SIOC, Strategic Information Operating Center.
It's hard to do 51 days, but I think if we go back to March 1st, right after the siege, something really critical happened that was talked about then the whole 51 days, and that is that David Koresh agreed to actually come out and surrender and give himself up so it would have been over after 2 days, I guess, if they would broadcast a sermon, a teaching, hesitate to call it a sermon, but a exposition of his message of the seven seals. He did make a tape that lasted 58 minutes, about an hour. And after it was broadcast, I would say in a more limited way than he expected. If you look at the agreement, it's telephone calls back and forth. He wants something national that's going to go to the whole country, which is quite a bit to expect, but that was what he wanted, get his message out to the world. And it was actually played on a fairly limited Christian radio network, but it did get transcribed and printed in newspapers such as the Dallas Morning News and the Waco paper, and other papers picked up on it. But then after it was broadcast, David said, I've got a message from God that I'm supposed to wait. And what I really wanted to emphasize here is that set him up as being a liar. And we heard it then for 51 days. He's unreliable, he's a liar, he gives his word and then he breaks it.
These are the FBI agents saying that.
That's right. And anyone who would listen. You know, he's a cult leader, he lies, he manipulates. So let's talk about that. I've got things to say about the tape.
Well, he said that he had been told by God not to come out, but at that time, but he had been told to wait, and then he would be told to come out. So there was a promise of waiting with an end result of a time when he would exit with his people.
I don't know if he said that or not.
Well, it's a waiting period, and what are you waiting for? If you can't come out now, you're waiting for a time when you will come out.
I know
the logic of it.
Gary Noesner, the head negotiator, later said that he expected that, didn't surprise him at all. I think the negotiators weren't that surprised, but the tactical team definitely was disappointed and angry, and that anger contributed to a growing divide between the tactical team and the negotiators that played itself out in very dangerous ways and led to, I think, the kind of catastrophic ending that we saw.
But the negotiators do mention often over the period that follows Well, how do we know you're going to do that? Because before you said it and you lied. So they at least picked up on it, even if they expected it.
And Koresh defended himself, saying, it wasn't that I lied, it was that God Almighty, he says, I have a commander in heaven. You FBI agents have a commander on earth, but I have a commander in heaven. If he gives me an order to wait, I have to obey it.
Gary Noesner, who was the negotiation coordinator, an FBI agent, from March 1 through March 24th, when he was taken off the case, as Stewart said, he was expecting, some things to happen. They would make promises, they would break them, and he has articulated that his negotiation philosophy was, he called it trickle, flow, gush. You have get a few people out, then you get a few more people out, and then finally they all come out, or at least most of them. One reason I think David was motivated to make a deal for them to play that 58-minute sermon. Now, of course, he was wounded, he was severely wounded, but he still recorded that. But on February 28th, even though he was wounded, he's calling CNN. He calls a Dallas radio station. But when the FBI agents got there, they cut off his telephone contact, and then they ran a telephone line that only went to the negotiators. Now, David's ultimate concern is to save souls. The judgment's coming. And so I think that was a big motivating factor for him to record that sermon. The log shows that when the Branch Davidian men started to carry David down the stairs on a stretcher, he was in a lot of pain, had no pain medication. And he said, let's wait and pray. And he prayed, and then he got that message, God says to wait.
I think for me that tape was a key because you and I, Phil, got hold of the transcript and read it, and it was being characterized almost universally as nonsense, incoherent, Bible babble. Now, he is wounded, but still. So you could see maybe some of that was there because of his physical condition. But I remember talking to you on the phone. I was in Charlotte, North Carolina. You were in probably Houston when we were actually going over it. And we immediately recognized that it had been badly transcribed. And the best example I remember from that is there was a phrase in there, the liar of the trial of Judas. Now, I don't know anybody that could make sense. The liar of the, like Judas had it, Judas Iscariot? What are you talking about? It's crazy. It clearly was the lion of the tribe of Judah. So you have somebody listening and typing, but they have no biblical understanding.
So Koresh has it right, and the transcriber gets it wrong.
And that's just an example. I'm not saying every phrase was that way, but of course that would sound like babble. It's not even a coherent phrase that makes any sense. But beyond that, let's say we had a clear transcript, and we could figure a lot of that out. It actually was fairly systematic and held together. And that's what you and I first noticed, because we didn't know. Is he an unstable, almost mentally ill kind of guy that can't coherently even hold a thought together? And I think we decided from reading it, no, he actually has a system. And we began to suspect that that's why the people were sticking with him, because he was an interpreter of Scripture. And that became completely confirmed. As time went on, we heard more tapes. We heard why the tapes came out from the Branch Davidians, interviews with them that the FBI later released, saying, why are we here? Why aren't we coming out? And it all fit together, that they were there for the reasons we've been discussing, that David had this sense of biblical interpretation. They were convinced that he was who he said he was. Well, that makes all the difference in the world then. And we had to come up with a strategy.
Once we got hold of that printed sermon, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, that was within a day or two of March 2nd. We looked at it, and I remember reading it and thinking, well, this sounds very similar to Seventh-day Adventist prophetic interpretation, going back over 125 years. And I thought, So David Koresh is very familiar with Adventist interpretation of prophecy. He's got seals, he's got the book of Daniel, he's got references to symbolic figures mentioned in the book of Revelation, the book of Daniel. And I remember thinking, yeah, he has a pattern that he's following. He believes these things are step-by-step fulfillments that could lead to tragedy, or it could lead to a resolution of the crises. And he believes we're in the end time. And that's when we began to take him seriously as an interpreter. And that's when we thought, well, if we can contact the FBI and explain to them that the community, the church community, is following an interpretation of Bible prophecy that they think makes sense and that we can interpret, that would be like giving the FBI secret intel to what the group may do next. And the FBI could use that intel to resolve the crises peacefully and to avoid making a mistake that could precipitate a terrible calamity.
So in this tape, the 58-minute tape, I believe David says, we're in the fifth seal now. What does that mean?
Yeah, that was chilling for us because we knew exactly what it meant. The fifth seal basically says that a small group of the believers have been killed, and then you're to wait until the rest are killed. Now that's a scenario for the very end times, and it's before the sixth seal. There's 7 altogether. The 7, it's all over. But the sixth seal, you get earthquakes and judgment, and all hell breaks loose, as we say, what people call the end of time. So you're right on the cusp of the end of time, with some killed and then waiting. So the waiting suddenly just jumps out at us, because in the sermon, the 58-minute, he hadn't said, I've got the word to wait yet. But that word is actually in the sixth seal, Revelation chapter 6. And so we thought, well, that's what he's thinking. And so is there any window or space of interpretation, or is it just inevitable? We wait till everybody's dead. And if so, then it was very bleak. But we began to study more details of his interpretation.
And we contacted the FBI. I can remember being on the telephone with agents, and I kept asking them, has he told you verbally which seal he thinks he's in? Well, that was hard for them to understand that question. What do you mean, does he think he's in some seal? How do you get in a seal? Yeah. And I said, I can remember telling them, think of the 7 seals as 7 acts of a play. And let's assume we're in Act 1. That's okay. If he thinks he's in Act 1, that's not a very dangerous part of the drama, part of the play. The play begins to be very dangerous when you get around Seal 5. And Seal 6 is quite a calamity. So I need to know, agent, if you could go find out from your superiors, which seal does he say he's on? And so finally I remember the agent says, okay, I'll do my best to find out. I said, when are you going to be back on duty, sir? This is very early March, I was talking to him. He says, I'll be here at 2 a.m. I said, I'll call you at 2 a.m. So I waited and I called him at 2 a.m. He said, I asked my superiors and they said that David Koresh has said he's in the 5th seal. So when I heard that, I knew that our time was short to try to salvage and save the situation, because the 5th seal, as Dr. Tabor has just said, says that some people have been killed. I began to realize that must be February 28th, when 6 of the Davidians were killed, and the rest of them will be killed later, assuming that the prophecies go along the destructive path and there's not a resolution made. So I knew then that we had to act, and we had to act quickly.
The bugs were placed in the building. Initially, the FBI would...
Hearing devices.
Listening
surveillance
devices.
I didn't want anybody to think they were
No.
palmetto bugs or
These
something.
are, yeah.
I'm just teasing.
This is the source from surveillance devices, or
Right.
the so-called bug tapes.
So they snuck those in with...
They snuck them in, but Graham Craddock, a survivor, says he found most of them, and then ultimately they just quarantined all the objects the FBI sent in into one room. So there must have been some other way to insert these surveillance devices into the building. Of course, federal agents aren't telling us
Yeah,
what
they can.
that was.
I'm sure they have ways of listening. Yeah.
But especially toward the end of the siege, especially when, well, after an argument that David had with a negotiator named Henry, this was on April 18th, the tanks were clearing out the
Right
vehicles.
before the fire.
They could see that an assault was pending, and David calls Henry and he says, "What do you men really want?" And so after that argument, then the surveillance devices pick up a number of conversations among Branch Davidians about fire, fulfillment of prophecy, and they were perfectly audible. I could hear them just using headphones. There's a memo written by Byron Sage. He says that there were 11 surveillance devices in the building. They had 11 FBI agents monitoring those surveillance devices. An Army colonel, Rodney Rawlings, in '99 said there were many more bugs inside the building. But in other words, these were audible conversations. And so the decision makers knew that they believed that a fire was coming to fulfill prophecies. So the question is, why would they?
Why deliver the very thing?
Why would you deliver this opportunity for a suicide by cop? That's the big question I have. What do you think?
One answer would be that the FBI didn't know that. But you've given us evidence that Steve told them prophecies predicted such a thing, and that some of the people who were ex-members warned the FBI about it.
Even members.
And then you've got members, and then you've got bug tapes picking up conversations to the effect that there could be some kind of fire. They're praying it won't be, but it could be.
See, what the FBI has done is that after the fire, and you had 76 deaths in the building, in the fire, including 2 babies that were born in the fire, the FBI has produced transcripts of these bug tapes, the discussions of fire, saying, see, there was nothing we could do. They were going to set themselves on fire anyway. But that's ignoring the interactive context. The Branch Davidians were responding to what the FBI agents were doing.
The gas attack, yeah.
And the FBI agents, the commanders, including officials in SIOC, they had a choice not to carry out that tank and CS assault. The log shows that at around 1 a.m. on the morning of April 19th, one of the entries in the log indicates that the FBI had a pediatric burn specialist on standby at the Galveston Burn Clinic. So, you know, a doctor down in Galveston knows they're going to launch an assault. I don't think so. But so the FBI would have had to have called this doctor and asked him to be on standby. So they knew that there would be casualties from burns. And one other point I want to make is that even if the Branch Davidians didn't have a theology about martyrdom and fire, just running tanks into a wooden building after they've inserted CS gas, there's a lot of kerosene in the building, there's a big propane tank directly behind the central tower. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that a fire was likely. So just looking at it, you know, excluding the theological component, they knew a fire was likely. And why would anyone think that that was a good idea to carry out that assault?
And if you go back to compound that, if you go back, okay, the fire's on the 19th, go back to April 1st, 2 weeks earlier, let's talk a little bit about another factor that was at work, that there was actually an exit plan, a surrender plan, that did involve the theology and could have worked, and we'll explain it. But think about the juxtaposition here of knowing that was going on and yet not making use of it, and knowing that if you don't make use of it, everybody's going to be dead, and then you still behave that way. So, Phil, you initiated that. Why not? Let's talk about that, because that's the one thing in most of our documentaries I've watched for all these years now, decades. It gets mentioned occasionally, but I mean, this was really something involving the lawyers, and I don't think most people even are aware of this.
We were pretty discouraged by mid-March that the FBI was not going to incorporate worldview translators. They're not going to listen to Bible experts trying to help them figure out when David Koresh might do this or that. We were all in the waiting period, waiting for it to end. And then toward the end of March, probably around the 25th or 26th of March, I got a phone call, a tip from one of the news agencies, CNN. And the reporter says to me, she says, I just wanted to call you and tell you, I know that the FBI is going to bring this to an end. They're going to go in on the Branch Davidians. That was a shock to me. I said, what are they going to do, use gas? And she just hangs up. That startled me, because I knew that if the FBI would try to use force, the religious group would not betray its principles. There's no way to get a religious person to deny their faith just because you're good to use force. But however you look at St. John, the same is true with other religious leaders. Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, he believes he must drink of that cup, even though he doesn't really want to. And when he's arrested, and when Judas and others want him to do something different, he has to pursue that which he's called to do. Knowing that, I had already tried the FBI. They were not willing to listen.